I need to start with a disclaimer. This video series is a personal project of mine. I've tasked myself with reading a book a week this year, and subsequently each week I want to do a video essay on each read. There's not going to be anything particularly robust about what I present. These aren't going to be necessarily reviews or overviews, except where that's necessary. But I want to present these pieces of literature, hopefully, as the meaningful books that they are, and to showcase what these books have to teach. And I especially hope that some of my peers and the people around me will start to pay attention to the lessons being taught here. To start off, we're going to be overviewing the Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, which is actually a book I had read at the end of last year because I didn't think I'd be able to do it in a week. It's a pretty dense book. For those of you that don't know, this book actually won a Nobel Prize for Literature in 1970 and was credited in part with the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, I don't want to turn these videos into simple reviews, but I should point out some of the key contextual points in this book, mainly Solzhenitsyn's background. Solzhenitsyn was an artillery captain in the Red Army and was swept up by the Stalin's machine for using dark humor and critical jokes against Stalin in a private letter to a friend from the front. For this crime of counter-revolutionary action, as it was called, he was sentenced to, in a show trial, to 8 years of hard labor in a Gulag camp. He served his term and was released in 1953 back into the general population. Almost a decade later, after much of his meditation and continued writing in freedom, and after the death of Stalin, Solzhenitsyn published his first work, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which is a precursor to the book that we're going over now. There's two distinct thematic sections of the book that I came across, separated somewhere at about the 2/3 mark. I think this is due to the difference in conditions Solzhenitsyn had to write in, as he had to memorize some 12,000 lines in camp before he was able to leave and transcribe them. These thousands of lines served to document the stories that he came across, as well as document a fair bit of the legal and cultural environment in the country. The latter third of the book, however, while still containing memories of his time in camp, serves to be a commentary on the whole lot, and seems to be infused with much more emotion than the first part. In part 1, 2 chapters stood out to me as rather poignant, titled The Interrogation and the Blue Caps. The former Solzhenitsyn uses to show us the system of arresting and interrogating officials he coins as the organs. While in theory, these officers were bound by legal code and decree, the only orders they would actually pay attention to was their arrest and conviction quotas, and everything else seemed to be just a tool to an end. As such, in many cases, minor or even non-existent infractions would be taken up by these organs, perhaps only on the word of an informant, and would subsequently take the accused and quote-unquote question them, aiming only to pull out a confession. It's easy to see how that kind of approach to law and subsequent arrest and convictions could go sideways, and it seemed to be exactly what happened. In Solzhenitsyn's own words, once it was established that charges had to be brought at any cost, and despite everything, threats of violence and tortures became inevitable. There was no measure or technique which the organs held off from using, because in their mind the idea of due process and fair legalese, and even absolute truth for that matter, were old bourgeois constructs, and they had no place in the newly ushered-in communist utopia. There was also rampant corruption within the organs as well, many of them using their elevated position to garner material wealth, to target potential rivals, or even in some cases ridding the women they fancied of their husbands. Of course, never once was it admitted to in any official sense, and was actually the prevailing social theory which led to a complete lack of necessity to have an institution of accountability to the public for their governance. You see, in the Soviets' eyes, corruption was an extension of the class warfare that had prevailed in the world for centuries. However, since the October Revolution in Russia, all classes had been abolished, and as such, corruption was no longer part of the corpus of human capability. I mean, how could anyone be corrupt? He had no more class to corrupt him, and he no longer had a class to affiliate himself with, in which would be benefited by the product of his corruption. And furthermore, anyone who accused the state or its actors as being corrupt, they were accused of using ideologies of past oppressors to reinstate a class-based system. The common thought was that all that had been left of the world was the state, the people it represented, and those that sought to ruin them both. However, the mistake for the Soviets was that they thought the malcontents could be isolated, sought out, and destroyed permanently. The assumption being made that the evil or malicious components of a system were localized to a specific people. But this assumption is what left the state and its people defenseless against its own potential tyranny. I left this chapter with a strong sense of just how much reality had been twisted and how well grounded in rationality the reasons had been made. You see, rational, intelligent people, much like us, rationalized away their transgressions. One of the things I noticed was what I called the rape of trust, that the organs used the average citizen's agreeable tendency, and especially their trust of the state, to coerce people into being easily arrested and above all using rampant lies throughout the whole process to accomplish their goals. This reminded me of Dante's Inferno, actually. From my understanding, as Dante reaches the 9th level of hell, he finds at it Satan, trapped in ice, surrounded by those who betray others. The idea posited here is that the sin that landed you in the worst imaginable state of existence was betrayal. And to take it a step further, that hell on earth is manifest when betrayal is rampant. I think that idea is what made it so disheartening reading the first part of the book. I mean, the fact that people were so willing and ready to transgress against each other in the most intimate and deeply cutting acts, it made the gravity of that world very, very real for me. Then I immediately went on to the next chapter where Solzhenitsyn searches his memories and finds he had an opportunity to go to the NKVD school and potentially could have been one of the blue caps that these schools produced, which is what the chapter is titled after. And for the sake of clarity, the blue caps were given that name because these government enforcers usually wore caps that had a prominent blue color to identify them easily, and these blue caps were what made up the organs. There's a chilling idea posited in this chapter as well. In the previous chapter, Solzhenitsyn makes it very clear just how horrifying the arresters and interrogators could act for the purpose of quote-unquote justifiable causes, how little empathy they could afford, and the extent of the corruption of such a system, given that there was no assumed need for just accountability of this judicial body of the government. However, the next chapter reads out very much like a proper argument, not only why there is only arbitrary reasons that you may be on the side of the interrogator's table rather than the other, but that given the choice, almost anyone would gravitate towards the kind of power that the blue caps had, and not simply to defend against being the one interrogated, but because it was very, very enticing to people. To think that the position wasn't enticing, or as Solzhenitsyn says, intoxicating, I think is to be dishonest with yourself. To be an NKVD officer was to be someone who universally inspired awe in the eyes of nearly everyone in society. You were the most important person in any room. Wherever a decision had to be made, your word was the final say. You had these powers, and for many, these powers were the main attraction of such positions. And here's where we find a powerful juxtaposition that just struck me to the core. What's essentially said here is that these organs were some of the most twisted and intelligent people that you could encounter. That the state and prevailing social theory had laid out the path for these people to get to power, and subsequently avoided the idea of accountability of the state to truth or to the people. And also that these people continually participated in and helped perpetuate the moral devolution of their society through deceit and betrayal. Not only that, but there was no reason to assume that anything other than arbitrary circumstances led you to being on one side of the table or the other. And an even more terrible admittance is that, given the chance, you would want to be one of these actors. I think you can see very clearly how this passage served as the foundational idea behind what I think is the most famous quote from the book. In reading from the book itself, the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts. That's a line that Solzhenitsyn wrote towards the end of his book. And you can see how Solzhenitsyn's using his time in camp to grab at that idea. You can tell in this early passage he's still grasping at it and would later articulate it. There was another excerpt that I wanted to highlight in particular. This is more of an anecdotal story, but it's a story of a girl in camp named Zoya Lescheva, whose family had been swept up and thrown into camp for their crime of faith. I don't want to recount it here as it produced a rather strong emotional response for me, so suffice to say I was astounded at this girl's continual strength in the face of harsh reality. I could only hope that the potential daughter I have could find the same strength against tyranny should it crop up in her lifetime. But on another note, this story showed me just how wasteful the Soviet system was with its people. Many of Solzhenitsyn's stories emphasized the endurance of the strongest in human spirit, and showed the quality of these kinds of people that were subject to the unnecessarily harsh and artificial conditions. I was just left to think of
how much these people could have done if they were allowed to flourish in the real world instead of rot away in camp. How much could have been accomplished if they had set their strong character against the world rather than against the state itself. And on that note, I wanted to thank everybody for trudging through this video with me and listening to a kid talk about things he probably knows nothing about. But if you happen to enjoy that, make it known. I realized that I left a lot of this book out of this video, and that was for conciseness' sake. This video would have been hours long if I had put in everything that I thought was worthwhile. But if you are interested in reading this book, I'll link it in the description for you. The artwork for this video was done by my sister. I'll be linking her Instagram down below. I would suggest go checking her out. She's got some really nice pieces up there, and she does commissions if you're interested in something for yourself.